Welcome to Enchanted Astrology with Ariel Smith. Thank you so much for joining me today as we explore the astrology for the week of July 1st until July 7th. Now, Mars is very active this week as he forms a sextile to Jupiter in Leo, a sextile to Neptune in Aries, and trines Pluto in Aquarius. And all while he is conjunct Uranus in Gemini, which will be exact on July 3rd. And this will be playing out all week as Mars makes his journey through 1 to 6 degrees of Gemini. We also have the Sun in Cancer squaring Saturn in Aries on July 6th, and Chiron making notable aspects as he squares Jupiter at 0 degrees of Leo, and Chiron forms a sextile to that north node at 0 degrees of Pisces, which will play out for the duration of the week. Now, before we begin, I'd like to try something a little bit different this week. When I first created Enchanted Astrology, one of my intentions was to explore astrology through stories and fairy tales. I've always believed that stories have just a unique way of communicating the truth because they invite us to experience an idea rather than just have to understand it in a very specific way. So they allow each of us to discover our own meaning within them. And the planets never tell separate stories. When you look at the astrology of the week, they're all participating in one larger story together. So rather than moving through each aspect one by one, I thought it would be beautiful to explore the story that they're creating as a whole. So throughout our journey, I'll pause at the end of each chapter to connect it back to the astrology that's inspiring it. So you'll still hear about each of these week's planetary aspects. But my hope is that experiencing them together as a story might offer something a little different for you, because each of us will naturally relate to different parts of the journey, and that's part of the beauty of storytelling, where the meaning doesn't come from me, it comes from the conversation between the story and your own experience. So wherever you are, get comfortable and let's step into this week's story together. Now, this week feels like standing at the beginning of a path you've never noticed before. So imagine you've been walking through the same forest every day. You know every bend in the trail, every familiar tree. You know exactly where the path leads because you've walked it so many times that you hardly even notice where you're going anymore. Your feet just know the way before your mind even catches up. So most of us live this way more often than we realize. We wake up, we think the same thoughts that we've thought 100 times before. We respond to people in the same familiar ways. We tell ourselves the same stories about who we are. Maybe that's I'm shy, I'm always busy, I'm not creative, I'm too late, I'm not ready. And without realizing it, we keep walking the same trail. And we don't realize that we're choosing it, it just feels so familiar. But imagine that one morning, just as you're passing the oldest tree in the forest, you notice something you've somehow never seen before. A tiny path. It's almost hidden. It's very subtle. It isn't calling for your attention or anything. It's just there. And you almost keep walking past it. In fact, every part of you wants to just keep walking because the familiar path feels much more safe and predictable. It feels comfortable. but there's something deep inside you that whispers, what if? What if I took one step this way instead? Just one step. And to anyone else watching, nothing significant has happened. You simply moved your foot a few inches to the left, but everything has now changed. Because every journey begins with one small decision. And that feels like the invitation of this week's astrology. It's not saying change your entire life today, but to notice that one tiny choice may quietly become the beginning of an entirely different future. So one of my favorite ways to think about Gemini is through an old flip book. Maybe you made them when you were a child. You know, the ones where you draw a little stick figure on the page. And then on the next page, you move the arm just a tiny bit. And on the next page, the leg changes just slightly. Then another, then another. And when you flip through the pages quickly, the figure suddenly comes alive and it looks like it's running. But if you stop and examine any single page, almost nothing has changed. Life is often like that. Most of the time, we expect transformation to arrive through one enormous monument. A new job, a new relationship, a big move, a life-changing realization. But more often than not, our lives change because of hundreds of tiny moments that hardly seem important at the time. It could be one different conversation or one very honest answer. One afternoon where we decide to rest instead of push ourselves. One moment where we choose to be curious instead of respond from fear. Each one becomes another page in the flip book, and before we know it, we're living a completely different story. So this week reminds us that we are always writing the next page, whether we realize it or not. And this is where Mars and Uranus enter our story. Mars is action, he's movement. He is the part of us that says, let's do something. And Uranus is very different because Uranus is the part of us that says, oh, what if there was another way? He interrupts patterns, he surprises us, he opens doors we didn't even know existed. And together in Gemini, these two planets are walking us toward that tiny path in the forest. Mars gives us the courage to step towards it. Uranus reminds us that the path wasn't visible until we were ready to notice it. Sometimes we think life changes because extraordinary things happen. But often life changes because we become available to a new possibility. So maybe this week you suddenly see a solution you've overlooked for years. And maybe someone says one sentence that changes how you understand yourself. Maybe you decide to answer differently than you usually would. Maybe you send the email. Maybe you finally say no or yes. None of these moments seem particularly dramatic, but remember the flip book. Every page matters. Sometimes one tiny change becomes the beginning of an entirely different story. So Mars spends this week traveling through the first few degrees of Gemini while moving into an exact conjunction with Uranus on July 3rd. Mars brings momentum and action. Uranus brings innovation, surprise, and liberation from old patterns. And Gemini reminds us that life evolves through many small adjustments rather than one giant leap. So together, they suggest that even a seemingly ordinary choice this week can open a completely new timeline. Now, as you continue walking this unfamiliar path, you begin to notice something. You're not alone. There's a quiet presence walking beside you. It doesn't tell you where to go. It doesn't demand anything from you. It just asks a very gentle question. What if you stopped choosing from fear? Most of us don't realize how often fear quietly makes our decisions. We may tell ourselves we're just being practical, responsible, realistic, but sometimes being realistic is simply another name for staying familiar. Maybe you've always wanted to paint or write or start your own business or return to school or move somewhere new or tell someone how you really feel. Almost immediately, another voice appears and says, "That's not practical. What if you fail? People like me just don't do things like that." We've become so accustomed to listening to that voice that we mistake it for wisdom. But what if it isn't? What if the quieter voice, the one that feels hopeful, the one that lights something inside of you, is actually the wiser voice? From my perspective, our deepest dreams are not random. They're not here to torment us. They're not here to show us what we can't have. They are a compass. They point toward qualities that we're here to experience, like joy, creativity, freedom, love, authenticity. So maybe the dream isn't asking to happen just exactly the way that you imagined it, but maybe it's showing you who you are here to become. So instead of asking, will I ever get there? Now you start asking, who is this dream inviting me to become? Because maybe today that just means taking one small step in that direction. Because dreams don't become reality all at once. They become reality one page at a time. So Mars is also forming a harmonious sextile to Neptune and Aries throughout the week. Neptune represents our highest potential, unconditional love, imagination, and the deeper truth of who we are beyond fear. And in Aries, Neptune asks us to consciously choose our identity from that deeper place. Mars provides the courage to act on those quiet inner nudges, while Neptune reminds us that inspiration often speaks much more subtly than fear. So this is a beautiful week to ask yourself, if fear wasn't making the decision, what would love choose instead? So as you continue walking along this unfamiliar path, you begin to notice something else. You aren't just discovering new places, you're beginning to notice what you've been carrying. And perhaps you've been carrying it for so long that you've forgotten it's even there. Imagine a backpack resting on your shoulders. At first, it doesn't seem very heavy, you're very used to it because you've walked with it for years and years. But now that you've slowed down, you've decided to actually open this backpack. And inside are old stories. They are the stories of, I'm always the responsible one. I have to do everything myself. I'm too much. I'm not enough. I'm behind. I've missed my chance. I always struggle. So you reach inside and pull one of these stories out, and you look at it, and you can't remember exactly when you picked it up. Maybe someone handed it to you when you were very young. Maybe it came from a difficult experience. Maybe it wasn't even yours to begin with. And then you realize you don't actually have to put it back. For so much of our lives, we think transformation is about becoming someone new. But maybe transformation is actually much simpler than that. Maybe it's remembering that you were never meant to carry all of this. And as you place that old story on the forest floor, you immediately notice the backpack starts to become a lot lighter. And you take another few steps and they feel easier. You aren't trying harder, you're just carrying less. And this is something I've noticed about real growth. It rarely feels like adding more to ourselves. It feels more like subtracting. Less fear, less pretending, less apologizing for taking up space, less attachment to identities that don't fit. And every time we release one of these old stories, we discover there was more room for ourselves all along. And perhaps becoming yourself isn't about building a better version of you. Perhaps it's about uncovering the person who has been there underneath everything else. And this reflects Mars forming a beautiful trine with Pluto in Aquarius. So Pluto is the great transformer. Rather than asking us to become somebody different, Pluto dismantles the beliefs, the identities, and the patterns that no longer support our evolution. Now, Aquarius brings freedom and non-attachment. It reminds us that we are not our thoughts, our labels, or even our history. We can observe them. We can thank them even for bringing us this far, and we can allow them to fall away. So Mars gives us the willingness to participate in that process. Instead of clinging to familiar identities, we can become curious about who we are without them. So this is a beautiful week to ask yourself, what belief about myself am I finally ready to put down? Now you continue walking and the forest begins to open. The trees become a little farther apart now. The sunlight filters through the branches in a way it never could before. And you realize something. The forest hasn't actually changed. You have. Because you are no longer carrying the same weight, you begin to see the world differently. The colors seem brighter, the air feels lighter, even your breath changes. And then you notice someone else walking a little farther down the path and they smile at you. And you haven't done anything extraordinary. You haven't convinced them of anything. It's just that your joy has now become visible. And I think we sometimes believe we inspire people by having all the answers. But in my experience, we inspire people by giving ourselves permission to be fully alive. Have you ever met someone who was just so completely themselves? They were not trying to perform or impress anyone. They were just genuinely joyful. And you probably left that conversation feeling a little more like yourself too. And that's because authenticity is contagious. Courage is contagious. And joy is contagious. And when one person decides they no longer need to shrink themselves, everyone around them quietly receives permission to do the same. So we often imagine there isn't enough room for all of us to shine. But nature doesn't work that way. If we think about a garden, every flower blooms differently. The roses aren't competing with the lavender. The sunflowers aren't threatened by the daisies. Each one contributes something the others cannot, because diversity is what creates abundance. And the same is true for us. Your light never takes away from someone else's. It just helps illuminate the path for them. So Mars is also forming a supportive sextile with Jupiter in Leo this week. Jupiter expands everything it touches, and in Leo, it expands our willingness to express ourselves creatively, authentically, and with our whole hearts. And this aspect reminds us that becoming more ourselves is never selfish. As we embody more joy, confidence, and authenticity, we actually naturally encourage others to do the same. So expansion doesn't come from trying to become bigger than anyone else. It comes from becoming more completely ourselves. And eventually, in this journey, you arrive at an old wooden gate. It's beautiful. It's covered in moss. Clearly, it's been standing here for a very long time. You reach for the latch, but before you touch it, a voice appears. And it says, "What makes you think you can go through?" You pause. This voice sounds strangely familiar because you've heard it before many times. Who do you think you are? What if you're wrong? What if this doesn't work? People like you don't do things like this. You should probably stay where it's safe. And you stand there for a moment, noticing the conversation happening inside of you. It's interesting, isn't it? The gate itself isn't locked. Nothing is physically stopping you. The only thing standing between you and the next part of the journey is the story you've been telling yourself. Sometimes we imagine our greatest obstacles are outside of us, in other people, circumstances, timing. But often the greatest limitation is the identity that we've become attached to. The version of ourselves we've practiced being for so long that we mistake it for who we truly are. This week asks an incredibly compassionate question. What if your limits aren't your reality? What if they're simply just yesterday's conclusions? And if they were created, they can also be recreated. one choice at a time, one new page in the flip book, one new step down the path. So on July 6th, the Sun in Cancer forms a square to Saturn in Aries, and the Sun represents our conscious awareness and our life force. In Cancer, it reminds us of our deeper belonging, who we are beneath conditioning. Saturn represents the structures that we've built over time. In Aries, these structures often become our very definition of self. So this square is an invitation because Cancer asks us to remember who we really are. And Saturn asks us to notice the identities that we've constructed that may no longer fit. Where do those two stories meet? So you rest your hand on the old wooden gate, and for a moment, you don't move. And you're not afraid of what's on the other side. You're just beginning to wonder why you were ever afraid in the first place. As you stand there, you notice someone sitting beside the path. There is a kindness about them, the kind of presence that doesn't try to fix you. It just makes you feel seen. And they smile and they ask you, when did you stop believing the earth would hold you? At first, the question doesn't make sense. Of course, the earth holds you. You've been walking on it your entire life. But then you realize they aren't talking about the ground beneath your feet. They're talking about your relationship with life itself. Somewhere along the way, many of us learned that life is something we have to survive, that there isn't enough, that we have to compete for love, compete for opportunities, compete for security. We learned that if we aren't constantly striving, constantly proving ourselves, somehow we'll fall behind. And without even realizing it, we begin relating to life as though it were an adversary instead of a companion. We brace ourselves, we tighten, we prepare for disappointment before it even arrives. And over time, that way of moving through the world starts to feel very normal. But imagine a child learning to walk. That child doesn't question whether the ground wants to support them. They simply just reach toward the next step again and again. Falling isn't proof that the earth has rejected them. It's simply part of learning how to move. And perhaps somewhere along the way we forgot that. Perhaps we stopped trusting life. And it's not that life stopped supporting us, but pain just convinced us that it had. And there is a quiet wound many of us carry. It's very subtle, and it whispers, you have to earn your place here. You have to deserve abundance. You have to prove your worth. But what if that wound has never been telling the truth? What if belonging was never something you had to achieve? What if it has always been your starting place? So the person beside the path gently picks up a small stone and places it in your hand. There is meaning everywhere, they say. And not because someone else decided what this stone means, but because you are in relationship with it. So you look around, the wind moving through the trees, the birds, the sunlight, the conversations you've had this week, the unexpected phone call, the book that seemed to fall off the shelf at exactly the right moment, the stranger who smiled at you when you needed it. Perhaps life has been speaking all along. And it doesn't speak in loud, dramatic announcements. It speaks to us in quiet invitations. And they don't control you or predict your future, but they reflect something back to you. Like looking into a still lake. The reflection isn't separate from you. And the reflection responds to you. Life may be much more like that than we've been taught. Perhaps life isn't a machine producing random events. Perhaps it's a relationship. It's a living, breathing conversation. Not one where every event has one single fixed meaning, but one where meaning is something we discover through our own awareness. I think that's one of the most beautiful parts of being human. No one else gets to decide what your life means. No one else gets to tell you what this season is asking of you. Only you can listen deeply enough to know. And perhaps that's why intuition feels so quiet. It isn't trying to compete with fear. It's patiently waiting until we are willing to hear it. So throughout this week, Chiron in Taurus forms a supportive sextile to the North Node in Pisces. Chiron reveals places where we've learned to disconnect from ourselves, especially around worth, stability, safety, and our relationship with the physical world. And many of us have inherited beliefs that life is fundamentally about struggle or survival. And the North Node in Pisces is pointing us toward another possibility. It's reminding us that we are not separate from life. We are participating with it. And rather than seeing the world as random or indifferent, Pisces invites us into a relationship of trust, intuition, and meaning. So this isn't about trying to force some type of symbolism onto every single thing that happens. It's more about becoming present enough, aware enough to notice how life is always in conversation with us. You thank the stranger and continue walking, and the gate opens easily. On the other side is a beautiful clearing. The light is warm, the air feels different somehow, and you take a deep breath. And then something unexpected happens. You don't feel like a different person, but you feel more like yourself. Isn't that interesting? So often we imagine growth means becoming someone else, someone wiser, someone more confident, someone more successful. But perhaps real growth feels exactly the opposite. Perhaps it feels more like coming home, like taking off clothes that were always a little too tight and never quite fit properly, like hearing your own voice after years of listening to everyone else's, like remembering something you've always known. The path didn't create a new you, it revealed the one who was there all along. And there is one final lesson waiting in the clearing. And as you stand there, you notice something stirring inside of you. A desire to create, to express, to love more fully, to stop hiding, to let yourself be seen. And immediately, another voice appears. But is it safe? What if people don't understand? What if I lose everything? What if I finally become who I really am and it still isn't enough? Perhaps this is one of the deepest human questions. Not whether we're capable of becoming ourselves, but whether we believe it's safe to. And this week doesn't ask us to answer that question all at once. It just asks us to be aware of it and to meet it with compassion, because healing isn't forcing ourselves past fear. Healing is understanding why the fear appeared in the first place, and then choosing with great kindness to take one more step anyway. So Jupiter in Leo is forming a square to Chiron in Taurus. Jupiter wants to expand our lives. In Leo, it encourages us to express ourselves boldly, creatively, and authentically. But Chiron reminds us of old wounds around worthiness, safety, and whether we truly believe we have permission to take up space. And this square isn't telling us to stop expanding. It's revealing the beliefs that still question whether expansion is safe. And so those beliefs become visible. They can begin to heal. So as you look back toward the forest, you can barely see the place where this journey began. That tiny path is almost invisible from here. And yet, everything changed because you decided to take one small step, not one giant leap. It was one conversation, one different thought, one act of courage, one moment of honesty, one choice that was rooted in love instead of fear. And that's how life changes. Page by page, moment by moment, choice by choice. And perhaps that is why the present moment is so powerful, because it is the only page we can write. We cannot rewrite yesterday's pages, and we cannot skip ahead to tomorrow's. But this page, this moment, this breath, this choice is where all of our creative power lives. So if this week offers you a tiny path you've never noticed before, pause. Get curious. You don't have to know where it leads. You don't even have to see the entire journey. You only have to be willing to just take the next step. Because every extraordinary life is simply the accumulation of ordinary moments chosen consciously, one page at a time. So thank you so much for joining me for this week's exploration of the astrology. If you would like to work more intentionally with this energy, This week's Yin Yoga practice explores the Jupiter Chiron square, which is gently uncovering the beliefs and old stories that may still be limiting your expansion, while creating space for a more authentic expression of who you are becoming. And you can find that practice through the Enchanted Astrology Yoga Studio, and I will leave the link in the show notes. Now, until next week, may you trust the quiet path that's calling your name. May you notice the small choices that shape your story. And may you remember that becoming more yourself is never about becoming someone new. It's about having the courage to come home to who you've always been. Now have a beautiful week, and I will see you next Wednesday.